Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things did happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, we're going to talk about shadow beings. I did a show once before, a couple of years ago, on this same subject, but there's some new stories that I've found, and a lot of these I'll bet you've never heard before. This has been a busy week. I'm still editing my book, Paranormal Laredo. I ran into a few weird snags. I save everything as I work. I hit that button every few minutes ever since I lost 10 hours of work on my book Saucers. So I've gotten in the habit of saving my work often, very often. I don't just save it to my computer either. I have an external hard drive that I keep hooked up, and I send all of my books and notes to it. That one time I was working on the show and my computer just died. The motherboard went kaputski. It was on a Wednesday, and I'd already done the entire show notes, and all I had to do was record it. I ran with my computer to Best Buy, and the Geek Squad managed to load the data onto a hard disk, and that way I was able to do the show the next day. I had to use an old laptop that was so slow it was practically like using a typewriter. Well, I was editing the latest book, and I realized that a really neat story was missing. My neighbor had told me about how her daughter had seen what sounded like a demon. I searched the file, but I found nothing. Fortunately, I'd sent her the draft for her approval, and I simply looked up the notes I'd sent her and I retyped it onto the file. Well, this got me to wondering, what if I might be missing other good stories? So I dug out my notebooks and I did a quick scan. Turns out there were several stories missing. I searched my computer and I found out there was a second book file in my document file. I opened it and I found 10 stories saved there that didn't make it to the external drive. Next book, I'll know to check in weird places for copies of my work. It's kind of weird how one copy of the book had some stories and the other copy of the book had other stories, but the two didn't quite line up. Anyway, I'm getting there. Hopefully before the end of this month I'll have it out for publishing. A Tuesday evening I was on Beyond Reality Radio with J.V. Johnson. I got to talk about my book, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal. I was on the first 30 minutes of the show. Someday I hope to catch Jason Hawes on the show. He is the second host, but he's almost never there. Of course, having a TV show that takes him all over the country means he has hardly any time for the radio show. Someday I'll catch up with him. Having talked to Art Bell, Stanton Friedman, and Travis Walton, I'm trying to close out my bucket list. If you want to listen, you can find the show at beyondrealityradio.com. They have some pretty good stories. J.V. Johnson is a very good host, and they have some interesting things to talk about. And who knows, you just might catch Jason Hawes on there. Shadow beings. What are they, and why do some folks see them? Experts say there are people out there who claim to be experts. Experts say shadow beings are the spirits of dead people trying to manifest themselves, but they don't know how to do it, or they don't have the energy to make themselves totally visible. I get a kick out of folks who lay claim to knowing things like this. I read one person's work who said a ghost was seen as a white, translucent vapor, like human form. Okay, never mind all the people who have seen ghosts that look like normal people up until they vanish. I'm going to stop right there before I upset too many experts. Natalia Kuna, intuitive energy healer and founder of Spiritual Academy, had this to say on her webpage. The majority of shadow figures that people experience seem to be negative, malevolent, and parasitic. Some are possibly demonic creatures or even evil spirits or entities. At the very least, you will see them in a flash of a moment, or will get the sense of being watched or observed. Some people report the being felt neutral or not harmful. There might also be only so much that they can do. It is possible that some are relatively benevolent, or even work with spirit in general to serve as a kind of guardian or warning system. At the very worst, one might encounter a being that is extremely evil and predatory and out to take people's spirits or ultimately their lives. But I would not focus on that. You can become empowered and learn how to protect yourself and deal with these situations, but she said she would go into more of that later on. These beings are dark, inorganic, phantom-like bipedal figures that look just like a dark black shadow of a person, but don't seem to quite have a full human form or facial or bodily delineations. They feel very masculine and oppressive and like something that is beyond human and out of our scope of understanding. Often people report them as being really tall, like about 7 feet in height or so, though they can configure and transform into different sizes and shapes. Often their limbs seem quite long, and occasionally fingers are seen. She also went on to say that shadow beings look two-dimensional, though some have appeared to be three-dimensional, and seem to be made out of some kind of a dark etheric substance. They appear as one mass that is completely black and opaque, but it doesn't quite look solid in the way that we perceive usual physical form. Hence, they are called shadow beings. No light goes through them at all. They are known to dematerialize very quickly and even shapeshift into other forms, such as the figure of a cat, a dog, maybe a rodent, oddly shaped spiders, insects, and other creatures, or even just a formless mass. It has been suggested that their darkness is a form of camouflage, and perhaps they take on a rough humanoid outline in order to mimic and blend with us. Maybe we are not ready to fully understand who or what they are, what they represent, and where they're from. Thus, appearing as shadow form is their way to be mysterious and incognito. They might also appear different according to their own stage of development. We can also speculate that it is possible they are unable to materialize into any other form or color, like that is all they can muster. You could apply that principles as it is the same with ghosts and spiritual apparitions. They can only use energy to appear certain ways and only for short periods of time, and it does take a lot of energy. The dark shadow figures that have red or green eyes are said by some to be evil spirits. In other words, this means that they were extremely evil humans who have passed and transformed into this dark, ominous form in order to continue their evil, malevolent ways. Some people have seen shadow figures outdoors and in neutral settings like forests. These ones that hang around trees are said to be shadow stalkers. Some say that they are protective spirits that guard nature and protect the elements. They appear as shadow beings, but are possibly not actually harmful. One of the quirks of such shadow stalkers is that some of them mimic people who see them. So, when a person moves, they will move as well. When the person stops, they will stop. Another noticeable characteristic is that when they traverse through the woods, they do not cause the normal nature sound effects you would hear from an animal or a person, such as leaves rustling or twigs snapping. This is fascinating to me because it reminds me of what witnesses report about Bigfoot or the Sasquatch. It is believed that they too are able to do this, so they're interdimensional. If you'd like to read more on the subject of shadow beings, check out nataliacuna.com/shadow people. That's NATALIAKUNA.com. And she has lots of pages on the subject of shadow people. Rosemary Ellen Guiley had this to say about shadow beings and the Gein. I discovered that many shadow people experiencers are also ET experiencers, especially abductees. Through a long process, I concluded that shadow people are a shape-shifting form taken by Gein. Therefore, there is a profound connection between Gein and bad hauntings and ET abductions. For those of you that don't know, a Gein is also known as a genie. Furthermore, the footprint of the Gein are evident throughout our mythologies about ancient aliens and gods. The picture that emerged is of a major Gein involvement in all of our entity contact experiences throughout history. Supposedly, there are giveaway signs. In old Gein lore, they could not duplicate 100% of the human body, and usually their animal-like hairy legs and feet gave them away. I have speculated that shadow people wear hats and cowls to cover up imperfect heads. Some experiencers say the eyes of the human-shaped Gein will shift to odd colors or reptilian appearances. I believe the Gein and other shapeshifters are among us every day, and we never know unless we have certain experiences with them. Rosemary Ellen Guiley was an American writer on topics related to the supernatural and the occult and paranormal. And she was also on radio shows, certified hypnotist, a board director of the National Museum of Mysteries and Research, and the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters. She received the Lifetime Achievement Award for Upper Peninsula Paranormal Research Society. She has written more than 49 books, including 29 encyclopedias. You might see her a lot on the TV show Paranormal Caught on Camera. Back when I was compiling my show notes to put out a book on the show, I contacted all the folks that I had quoted on my show and asked if I could use their material in my book. It's one thing to quote them on the show, it's another to put their words down in writing. Rosemary Guiley was the only one that not only said I could use all of her information on shadow beings, she also wished me luck in the book sales. Unfortunately, Rosemary passed away July 22nd, 2019. I did manage to put together 2 books on Strange Things podcast. Any of my guests on the show, I would only mention that they were on the show and where you could find their interview. The show was their words and not mine, so I didn't feel right putting it in the book. I took all my notes and I rewrote them so they were readable. This took a lot of work, and when I sent them in for publishing, I got a lot of legal nonsense from the publisher. They wanted me to prove I owned the information in each book. Lots of back and forth on how I developed the information, and finally I was able to put the show out in print. If you have a burning desire to read up on the first 2 years of Strange Things, you can find them at Amazon.com. Heidi Hollis, the author of The Hat Man, The True Story of Evil Encounters, suggests that the Hat Man is a demonic entity or a minion of the devil. Hollis said this about the Hat Man. As a college student in 1995, I stumbled across 2 terrifying phenomena that I defined, named, and told the world about. As shadow people and the Hat Man. Both are demonic. As shadow people are dark beings who can shapeshift, aiming to blend with the night as they paralyze their victims. The Hat Man doesn't always mind being seen and will step out from the shadows so you can get a good look. He wants you to revere him for being evil incarnate. Heidi gave these figures names, but she didn't really invent them. Shadowy, human-like figures appear in Native American stories, and some of these shadow beings are said to be shapeshifters. Similar beings, called Jinn or Gein, date back to pre-Islamic mythology. They too are able to change their shape and are said to inhabit the world parallel to ours. Many people still believe in their existence. Der Grossmann was commonly described as a fairy of the Black Forest who takes away bad children who enter the forest at night. He was tall, thin, and dark, and he was a shadow figure. Parents would tell their kids they had better behave or the Grossmann would get them, just like the boogeyman. Not wanting to miss an opportunity to keep their kids in line, the story grew, saying that if a kid had done something bad and he wanted to avoid the Grossmann, the only way to escape was to confess to an adult whatever the bad deed had been. There are a few stories of kids being taken from their beds at night. In the morning, the mother would find the child was gone. None of his or her things were missing. Kids didn't run away. Well, kids did run away back then, but they would sneak away in just their bedclothes. These missing kids were blamed on the Grossmann. Since at the time few records were kept of commoners' kids that went missing, there's no way of knowing whether the Grossmann took just a few kids or maybe hundreds. Fear du Bois, or the Black Man, is a rare Scottish legend concerning a malevolent entity that haunts footpaths and forests at night. He's called the Black Man because he appears as just a shadow with no discernible features. Some called him the Dark Man. Parents used this being to keep their kids in line as well. Don't go wandering around in the dark or the fair Duda will get you. The Dark Man was seen late at night, hanging around trails through the woods or along the edges of rivers. People report seeing shadow beings in all types of places and times of day and at night. There have been a few seen in the daytime. Not every witness was half asleep when they had their encounter either. Here's what I have found as I did research on strange things over the years. Shadow beings are dark shapes seen where there is no one or anything that could make them. They look just like a shadow. Some look like a human, while others look like a cloud or an indistinct shape. There have been animal shadows and shadows that look like inanimate objects. A few reports say they could see red eyes. Others said the shadow was just a black shape with no features. A common witness occurrence goes like this. The person involved is sitting somewhere not thinking about ghosts or paranormal things, usually at home. They see somebody step up beside them out of the corner of their eye. The witness turns to see who is there, only to discover they're alone. Now, some folks brush this off as being their imagination. On occasion, the person will see a dark shape right in front of them. The shape sometimes looks like a person's shadow, only there's no one there to cast it. The shape might move from where it is first seen and cross the room. At Mall del Norte, folks working in one of the stores have seen a shadow being that moves around the store, knocking things off of shelves. The staff will catch a shadow out of the corner of their eye, and then the shoes will fall. This has happened often enough that the folks working there try to ignore it. There's a couple living here in Laredo that have seen shadow being in their home. The really odd thing is they see it when they're together more often than when they're alone. David, one of the Laredo Paranormal Research Society investigators, used to see a shadow being standing in the doorway of his bedroom back when he was 10 years old. It was tall and very dark. His room wasn't very big, so the creature was only about 8 feet from him. The shadow would stand there and watch him as he was laying in bed. Surprisingly, David wasn't afraid of this thing. He kind of felt as if it was there to keep him safe from some other unknown entity, kind of like a guardian angel on a black shadow. After a few years, David didn't see the shadow being anymore, but he did become very interested in the paranormal, and this got him to join the LPRS. This makes me think of something called the volunteer spirit. The idea is you have deceased relatives up there in heaven. One of them volunteers to come back to Earth to help you out with some unknown difficulty. Maybe you're having trouble with some nasty elemental and it's trying to do you harm. A family member comes down to help drive the entity away. This isn't just something I made up. I heard about these volunteer spirits from different spiritual groups, many who have very different ideas about life and death. Their concept of the volunteer spirit is pretty much the same. Now this brings up a worrisome thought. Having dead relatives come down to help out during a bad time in our lives means there might be the opposite force working as well. Those nasty folks who didn't go to heaven. What if they can volunteer to come back to Earth to do bad things? This is the kind of thing keeps me awake at night. Not everyone who encounters a shadow being feels comfortable with it. Most feel dread. Seeing some unknown, unexplained entity, especially in your home, can cause a lot of concern. Carmen was trying to get some sleep, as she was staying with her dad, while her brother stayed with her mother. It was hot, and the air conditioning in the bedroom was on the fritz, so her and her dad had moved into the living room, where it was much cooler. As she was laying there, one side of the room, something caught her attention. She looked. There was a shadow of a person standing in the kitchen. As she laid there, terrified, the shadow slowly faded away. The next night it was back. This time, the shadow was closer to her dad, who was laying there asleep and unaware of anything going on. Carmen was at a loss what to do. Finally, she mentioned the sighting to her brother, who said he'd seen it as well, only he had seen the shadow being in the daytime. The two kids decided they should mention this to their mother. Their mother wanted to know if any part of their dad's house felt unusually bad. The kids said their old bedroom felt odd. In the room, they had a pillow with a recording device that was supposed to quote Bible verses, only the recording sounded like something out of a horror movie. It was so bad, nobody ever wanted to push the button to make the voice come out. Their mother said the pillow had been given to them by some family friends who used a Ouija board a lot. Their dad was told about the shadow being and the possible connection to the pillow. He threw the pillow in the trash, and after that, the shadow being stopped visiting them. Oh yes, the Ouija board. Some folks think of this as being nothing more than a game. You can play with it if you want. The trouble is, if you don't really know what you're doing, how do you know you did it right? Say you contact somebody who says they died long ago and they just want to talk. You invite the spirit into your home, and then it's time for bed, so you close the board and try to get some sleep. To begin with, how do you know the entity moving the planchette is actually who they said they were? Second, how do you know you tell the spirit it's time to leave and they do? Are you sure it goes back to the other side when you say go away? I'm a curious individual. I will try just about anything. I've eaten some things I wish I'd avoided. Raw oysters taste like snot. Cat food tastes like liver. I hate liver. Dog food tastes like dirt. How do I know this? Well, had to try it. I will not use a Ouija board. I know I would screw up, and then I would spend the rest of my life entertaining some demon in my home. Nope. No thanks, not for me. A young girl here in town had an imaginary friend who would show up on occasion. This friend told her not to tell anybody about her. The family would see the young girl interacting with somebody they couldn't see, and they would ask about it. She would respond by saying, "I'm not supposed to say." As time passed on, the young girl began having bad experiences, especially late at night. Her aunt began keeping the girl with her at night. During one especially bad time, the young girl said the shadow being was hovering up in the corner of the ceiling. Her aunt began to pray, trying to drive the entity away. The young girl turned to her and said, "That's not going to work." The aunt looked at her niece, and the eyes were totally black. It made her think about the black-eyed children seen all over the country. Well, the aunt continued praying, and eventually the niece fell asleep. The next day, she was back to normal. Eventually, the shadow being stopped visiting. I've reached out to other paranormal researchers and investigators to see if they have found a connection between black-eyed children and shadow beings. Some of them said yes, they had heard a few times where both were found in the same report. The thing about both of these entities is no one knows what they want or why they're here. Black-eyed children won't enter without an invitation. Kind of like vampires from some legends. Those who have run into black-eyed children all say they were terrified by the encounter. Dogs will run and cower when these kids knock at the door. And on that pleasant note, I'm going to take a pause, play a couple commercials, drink some coffee, and try to relax. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Wrong button. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. Here in Laredo, there's a technical medical training facility. You can learn to be a pharmacy technician or a medical assistant. The building had been a physical therapy center at one time. Today, the students and staff have seen some odd things during school hours, as well as late at night. Some of the staff have seen a huge black shadow being. It looks like someone's shadow, only there's nobody around the room when they see it. The shadow is said to be nearly 7 feet tall, and it has been seen in all parts of the school. Not all shadow beings are seen inside or at night. Mandy was visiting Slaughter's Park here in Laredo. On the west side of the park is a beat-up road that leads to an old abandoned apartment building. As she was walking around looking at the building, she spotted a shadow in one of the upstairs rooms. As soon as the shadow realized it was being observed, it ducked down out of sight. Mandy looked up at the window, and she could see it was way too light for the room to be so dark. Light should have been spilling into the room through the open window. This was when she realized she'd been looking at a shadow being. She wasn't the only one to see a shadow being while at the park. Others have reported seeing a shadow moving about the fields even though it was a clear sky. The shadow looks like what you'd see if somebody was standing in the spot. These shadows move quickly around with no known cause for them. When I was collecting stories for one of my books, I'll ask people I'm interviewing if they want their names used or if I should use an alias. Some folks don't want to be thought of as being somebody that sees things, even if they did. It's surprising how many people will insist that I use the real name. Never know which way they're going to turn. So, when I'm writing a book, I have to sometimes try to come up with an alias for a particular individual, and then on other occasions, I'll just simply use the person's name. This next story came from somebody I call Bob in the book. Bob grew up in a family that had a tragedy before he was born. One of the girls was killed in a car accident as the... try that again. One of the girls was killed in a car accident. As the aunt who had been driving lay there waiting to be taken to the hospital, she saw her dead niece standing on the side of the road with a man that she recognized as a relative of theirs who had passed on several years ago. The niece said it was all right now, and the man was going to take care of her. A person known to the family said that the sister was going to come back to the family, only next time she was going to be a boy. Bob was born shortly after, and the family just decided he was the reincarnation of the dead girl. Talk about a confusing childhood. Well, Bob, don't get me wrong, they didn't dress him up like a girl and send him to school thinking he was a girl. No, they would just simply tell him that in his past life he had been a girl. Not like Ed Gein. Okay, now I'm going to have to tell that story, I guess. Ed Gein was the internationally famous serial killer who lived up in Wisconsin long before Jeffrey Dahmer came on the scene. In fact, I don't think Jeffrey Dahmer was even born when Ed Gein was running around doing his thing. When Ed was born, his mother already had one son, George. She didn't want two sons, so she simply decided that Ed was going to be her daughter. So she would dress Ed up in an appropriate manner and tell him he was a girl and have him do girl things around the house. And this continued up until it was time for him to go to school. So he shows up at school, and the school teacher thought he was a girl. He dressed like a girl. He looked like a girl. He acted like a girl. Right up until the moment that Ed had to go to the bathroom. And that's when the school teacher discovered that Ed's plumbing was different. She sent a note home with the confused young man, telling the mother to never send him to school in a dress again. Well, Ed grew up to be an infamous serial killer who not only killed a lot of people, but he also ate them. So Bob was not being dressed up like a girl. He just heard the stories about his dead sister, and that he was the reincarnation of her. Well, Bob began seeing a woman in the house. He knew she wasn't a living person because of how she looked. She was always dressed in white, and she was making his life miserable. Since she wouldn't leave him alone, he decided to try ignoring her. Well, once he was old enough and it was time to get his own place, he decided to move out. He moved to the north side of town. One night, Bob noticed there was a shadow being standing on the other side of the street from his apartment. It would just stand there, staring up at his window. It got to a point where Bob would look out the window to see if the shadow was there. Well, after several weeks, he noticed that the shadow was now standing in the street. A few weeks later, he looked out the window, and he could see that the shadow was now standing on the sidewalk on his side of the street, right in front of his apartment. It just kept getting closer every so often. One night, Bob was startled from his sleep. He awoke as if something was wrong, but when he tried to sit up, he found his body wouldn't move. He lay there wondering what was wrong. Finally, he was able to roll his eyes far enough to see the corner of his bedroom. There it was, the shadow being right there in his bedroom. After way too long, the shadow being faded away, and Bob found his body was his to command once more. As soon as the sun came up, he ran to his church, and he began to pray. Finding his faith restored, Bob didn't see the shadow anymore. He stopped looking for it after a few months. Hormones have bad effects on the brain, especially of males. Bob met some woman who he thought was his everything. Those who knew him tried to convince him she was not a nice person. She was going to be nothing but trouble. This is when the hormones really kicked in, and Bob just simply refused to listen. His girlfriend was a very negative person. She had nothing good to say about anyone, and everyone was just trying to tell him and her what to do. Bob was listening to her and ignoring his friends, who were all trying to get him to stop dating this woman. One day, Bob saw the shadow being had returned. It was when Bob saw the shadow standing across the street. Then, as time went by, the shadow began to get closer and closer. Well, Bob was scared by this apparition, and his drive to survive outweighed his hormones, telling him his girlfriend was not the one for him. It took all of his common sense to break up with this negative person. As soon as she was out of his life, the shadow being stopped showing up as well. Bob now makes it a habit to hang out with folks with a much nicer outlook on life. There it is, my daily phone call. They want to sell me something like an extended warranty for my truck, which has 200,000 miles on it. Anyway, Bob made it a habit to surround himself with people with a lot nicer outlook on life. And once he'd gotten his life under control and he'd mentioned the shadow being to his mother, she said that she'd seen the shadow around the house as well. This would lead me to believe that shadow beings are negative entities. They're drawn to unpleasantness. This wouldn't explain Dave's experience. To him, it was a positive thing. Either all shadow beings are not the same, or they're different things. Perhaps there's a different kind of shadow entity. I had a run-in with a shadow being a while ago, and I wasn't alone. And the guy with me was able to catch it on camera. December 2nd, 2014, we were doing some ghost hunting and training in an old abandoned hospital. We had permission to be there. It's a very bad idea to trespass looking for thrills. If you get caught, you get to visit the jail and meet some kind people you don't really want to meet. If you get hurt, you get to go to the hospital to get fixed up, and then maybe you get to go to jail when the police find out how you got hurt. Don't do it, get permission, or stay out. Ishmael had just gotten his newest gadget, and he was giving it a test run. He had a set of full-spectrum glasses with a 6-hour recording device. We were walking down the basement corridor en route to the morgue in the hospital. As we were passing the doors to the kitchen, Ishmael's ultraviolet flashlight dimmed down as if it was having a power drain. At the same time, something caught his attention out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head to say something to me, and as he was turning, he suddenly began coughing. It sounded like he'd inhaled some dust or something. We stood there waiting for him to clear his throat, and then we tried to figure out what he'd seen and why his light had dimmed. When nothing was readily explainable, we continued on to the morgue. It was a quiet night, and we pulled the plug after several hours, thinking, well, it had been a wasted trip. Then it was time to review the evidence on the cameras, the voice recorders, and Ishmael's new gadget. He plugged his recording device into a computer and he watched the video. Then he watched it again and again. Ishmael called me and he called Rick and he called a few others saying we needed to see what he had caught. We gathered around and we viewed the basement hallway. You can see the empty, abandoned hallway stretching out away from us. The light from his ultraviolet flashlight goes dim, and then you watch as the camera turns to the right. As the lens is passing the doors to the kitchen, there's a huge black shape right in the middle of the doors. The shadow being rushes out of the doors, and as it gets close to Ishmael, he begins to cough. As he's coughing, his head goes down and the shadow being disappears from view. We watched that video about 100 times, maybe more, over and over, not knowing what we had encountered. A huge shadow that filled the hospital doorway. I tried getting a screen capture from the video, but the image looked so fake when it was enhanced. A black shape on a black background that slowly turned gray. Watching the video, it looked so bizarre, but freezing the image washed out all of the details. Ishmael had been standing in the middle of the hallway. I was to his right, closer to the door. I was way too close to the shadow. At the time, all I knew was there was something in the dark. I had no idea I was so close to something so nasty looking. The LPRS travels around doing guest events a lot, especially around Halloween. One day we were invited to the McAllen Library. We set up all of our gear and we showed some of our videos. When Ishmael was playing the video of the shadow being, a woman in the middle of the audience said, "You can see a face on the shadow." We all looked at the screen, but we hadn't seen a face. We'd seen that video over 100 times, and we'd never seen a face. Ishmael began advancing the video, slowly, one frame at a time. Just before the shadow moves out of the doorway, you can see a skull-like face right where the head of the thing was. This was just one more weird thing to add to all of the weird things that happened in the old hospital. It was creepy and unnerving. If you want to get the whole story about this abandoned hospital, I talk about it in depth in my book, The Laredo Paranormal Research Society, which you can get at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, or you can pick it up at the Phoenix Bookstore on Victoria Street, or you can order it at Amazon.com. The most disturbing shadow being, as far as I'm concerned, are the ones that appear behind you while you're looking into a mirror. You see the shadow right behind you, but when you spin around to look, there's nothing there, as far as you can see. So what do? Look back in the mirror to see if the shadow being is getting closer? Or do you keep looking behind yourself to try seeing the thing before it gets you? Science tells us that 95% of the universe is composed of something called dark matter, which we're unable to see, plus many dimensions that are invisible to us as well. A theoretical physicist, Stephen Hawking, used to say there could be shadow galaxies, shadow stars, and even shadow people. In other words, entire populated realms could exist that we don't know about because we can't see them. The shadow being phenomena might be caused by other dimensions that overlap our own and occasionally intersect. There are lots of theories out there dealing with shadow beings. I disagree with some. This doesn't mean I know more about things than other folks. It just means that I disagree. Somehow, someone came to the conclusion if you didn't believe everything they said, you were some kind of a racist weirdo. I have a ton of friends that believe in Bigfoot. Some say Bigfoot is a giant ape that lives in the woods and needs to be found by people in white lab coats so we can all know that it's real. I disagree. I think Bigfoot can come and go from other dimensions. Why is for him to know and us to deal with? Do we have to know why Bigfoot appears to some folks and not others so we can believe in him? Nope. Does some guy in a white lab coat need to dissect a Bigfoot so we can all believe in him? Nope again. What are shadow beings? I don't know. I can make all kinds of wild guesses, but that won't answer the question. Why do shadow beings appear to some people, and what is their purpose? We just might never find out. This is a part of life. There are people out there that don't believe in anything their god of science can't explain. They lead very narrow and uninteresting lives. A photograph of 100 shadow beings will not convince certain people they are real. 1,000 witness reports won't do the trick either. Even having their own personal experience won't convince them the creatures are real. They might see one day, only to quickly convince themselves it was just an illusion. Should you encounter a shadow being, what should you do? Trust your feelings. If you don't feel scared, then just enjoy the sighting. Move your position in life from one who never sees anything to someone who has had a paranormal experience. If you see a shadow being and you feel uneasy, it's time to use one or two of those prayers your mother taught you. Don't lose yourself in fear. Perhaps this is what the shadow beings are feeding on. Take stock of your situation. Tell the shadow you're not impressed by its scary looks. Just because they don't communicate with us doesn't mean we can't communicate with them. Perhaps if you say something to the shadow being like, "I'm not afraid of no ghosts," maybe it'll go away. I did write a book called Shadows. It's about seeing something from the corner of your eye, but not when you look. The main character is a guy trying to recover from alcoholism. He had been a Dallas detective who got fired for drinking on the job. Needing a job, he manages to get hired in a small town as a deputy. And then murders start happening. The trouble is, each and every case, the murderer commits suicide. As more of these cases come up, the hero finds himself dealing with a shadow being. This book is not for kids. I had a 12-year-old wanted to buy my book one day at a book fair. I told him he needed his parents' permission. They said he could read it, so I let him have the book. There's a lot of bloody messes in it. I don't write like that anymore. I do get the urge once in a while. Maybe someday I'll put out another horror story, but that has yet to be seen. If you like gory stories, check out Shadows at Amazon.com. You'll probably have to put my name in the search box as well. There are several books out there called Shadows. I like fiction. It's easier to write. Nonfiction is a lot of work. You have to track down stories and write them up. Sometimes you find out the story is not real, so you have to scrap the work you just finished. Everything has to make sense. It has to sound real. In fiction, you can just invent things as you go. I do have rules about my fictional characters. The main character has to be a decent person. Maybe not the bravest or the nicest, but they have to be likable. And they don't break the law if they can help it. When I got away from horror and I started writing humor, I still maintained my rules. Pam Bogus is a teenager. I had her driving all over town with her young girl assistant in a pickup truck. Well, then I found out that in Texas, a teen can only drive during the daytime and no kids are allowed in the vehicle. When I got my license 46 years ago, this wasn't the way it was. So I got with one of my police friends and I did some asking. The Texas Graduated Driver's License program was implemented as a result of Senate Bill 577. This law changed original licensing requirements for people under the age of 18. The GDL creates 2 phases of driving requirements for a minor. My main character had to follow the law, so her dad pulled some strings in order to get Pam a GDL. Don't want my main character breaking the law, even if it is just a fictional story. Most vampire movies, the main character turns into a bat. How does a 150-pound person turn into a 3-pound bat? What happens to the rest of his body? There's 147 pounds of missing matter. So, in my book, This Sucks, the main character turns into a 150-pound bat. Plus, he doesn't know how to fly because we don't know how to fly. It takes him a long time to learn. The book, This Sucks, was fun to write. Lots of weird things happen. I bent history around a lot so it would fit into the book. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't around when Vlad was impaling people, so I had to change history just a bit. So that's pretty much it on shadow beings. Some of them are evil and some of them aren't. Some of them appear in the middle of the night and some of them will show up in the daytime. And you never know when one might just pop into view. As I said earlier, if you see a shadow being and you don't feel afraid of it, relax and enjoy the moment. If you do feel fear, try praying or tell it to go away and see what happens. If it works, let me know and I'll put the information out on the show. If it doesn't work, I'm sorry you listened to me. This is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.